My name's Danny. I'm going to be chairing the meeting today. I'm a feminist activist from Brighton and a member of the editorial board of The Radical Notion. I'm very proud to be on a WP UK platform again, and I'm grateful to them for 5 years of principled, organised campaigning, enabling women to have a voice on issues of sex and gender in law and policy. I believe that WP UK is due a good share of the credit for the remarkable shift in the Overton window that we have seen on these issues in the last few years in the UK. We're holding this panel because we think it's important and necessary for feminists to discuss our strategic choices. And where better to have that vital discussion than here at FiLiA. I know that there will be a range of opinions and views in this room, and that's great. Respectful disagreement is a political necessity. As Raquel Rosario Sanchez said at the opening plenary, this is how we learn. This is part of the work of developing our ideas. And disagreeing well takes some courage and some skill. Social media is designed to fragment and undermine the trust and connection that makes good faith disagreement possible. So this, here in real life, is a precious opportunity to hear each other without those barriers. Let's not waste it. So we have 4 phenomenal speakers today, and I'll be introducing them as we go along. First, it is an honour to introduce Pragna Patel. We're not actually going to get through it all if you clap every 5 minutes. Pragna is the ex-director and founding member of South All Black Sisters Advocacy and Campaigning Centre and Women Against Fundamentalism. For 40 years, she was at the helm of SBS and has been centrally involved in some of their most important cases and campaigns involving domestic violence, immigration, and religious fundamentalism. She is also a member of Feminist Dissent and has written extensively on race, gender, and religion.
I think it's really difficult to know where to start. It's kind of left, right, wither feminism, you know. I think if ever there was a time to take stock of where feminism is heading, surely it's now. Around the world, women are under intense and sustained attacks from ascendant fascist and authoritarian forces. These forces have become emboldened by the triumph of unbridled free market capitalism and the widening socio-economic disparities that has deepened the divide between wealth and that has increased disparities in wealth and power. These authoritarian and fascist forces have also ushered in a politics of hatred, intolerance, and violence that is driven by fear of the other, and holds sway as governments themselves become complicit in, if not drivers, of new forms of terror and censorship. In Europe, the far-right target migrants, Muslims, Roma, and other minorities who are perceived to threaten their monocultural and ethno-nationalist worldview, whilst the religious right denounce secularists, humanists, atheists, other religious and sexual minorities, as well as women. Both act as if they're opposed to each other, but they can and do converge when it comes to maintaining the so-called authenticity or purity of identity, culture, and tradition. What they have in common is the desire to protect their extremist ideologies by suppressing dissent, if necessary, by eliminating altogether those who try to promote the idea of our shared common humanity and the universality of human rights. Added to this is the complexity of identity politics that has gripped many on the so-called left, which is more often than not dominated by simplistic one-dimensional focus on diversity, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and post-colonialism. It is a framework that recognizes state-generated terror, oppression, and authoritarianism from above, but allows little or no room to critique authoritarianism from below. The logic of such politics is also divisive, since it too rejects universalism and descends into a form of moral absolutism in which internal critique is suppressed. In the face of these developments, where should feminism position itself? How can we avoid feminism becoming a vehicle for the reinvigoration of a hyper-masculine form of patriarchy and authoritarianism? My response is that we build an autonomous political home of our own. This is not a new idea or even a unique position. It is a lesson that I have learned from the history of black feminism of the late 70s and 80s, when we found ourselves politically homeless in the UK. Formed in the heat of anti-racist struggles and under the shadow of a rising neoliberal state, groups like Southall Black Sisters formed out of our frustration with the failure of the anti-racist movement to deal with the question of sex, and with the failure of the wider feminist movement to deal with the question of race. We argued that domestic abuse, forced marriage, rape, honor-based violence, and religious coercion, together with police brutality, homelessness, poverty, and harsh immigration laws, were all political priorities for feminism. And challenging this involves a multi-directional struggle. But we also understood that autonomous organization alone would not achieve political change, which is why we placed emphasis on building coalitions and solidarity networks. Even though on a daily basis we focused on challenging violence against women, we also tried to connect with other progressive left struggles for social justice. For example, we joined black delegations to the mining communities during the Great Strike of 1984. This time, whilst at the same time challenging the trade union and labor movement to confront its own blind spots on race and sex. This has not come easy to us, since the logic of identity politics has brought with it serious dilemmas and contradictions, particularly as the religious and far-right forces have sought to enter left and feminist spaces to legitimate a profoundly anti-democratic worldview. To give an example, around 2015, some South Asian women's groups in the UK debated the question of whether or not to support an amendment to the Serious Crime Bill which sought to criminalise sex selection abortion. Sex selection abortion, or female feticide, is a practice involving the abortion of a fetus for no other reason than it is female. It is one of the many forms of violence and discrimination faced by South Asian women, and in countries like India, it is pervasive. At the time, there was some anecdotal evidence to suggest that the practice was taking place in South Asian communities in the UK, but there was no hard evidence of its extent. However, we were alarmed by the proposal to criminalise it for two reasons. First, quite apart from the fact that there were evidential problems, there was no corresponding measures being proposed to ensure more specialist services to protect and support women, or to ensure better screening and risk assessments around reproductive coercion in routine medical examinations of pregnant women. We argued that the protection of women could be better achieved through a safeguarding framework as opposed to a criminalisation framework, and that the practice needed to be considered within a broader context of gender discrimination, including domestic violence and honour-based violence. But our second and perhaps more significant concern was that many of the groups calling for the criminalisation of sex selection abortion publicly claimed that they only wanted to clarify the existing law on abortion. But in reality, the issue was being used to bring in abortion limits by the back door. It was driven by the pro-life Christian right lobby, whose spokesperson was Nadine Dorris. Since at least 2012, she has often led campaigns on limiting the legal limit for abortion. In this instance, she was supported by Hindu and Sikh fundamentalist groups who claimed to be moderates, but who are anything but. They had quietly gone about using the state's multi-faith policies to communalize identities and to promote an agenda that threatened the rights of women and suppressed progressive struggles. So it was clear to us that the issue of sex selection abortion was being hijacked by the anti-abortion religious lobby, whose long-term agenda was to limit women's rights to abortion. People like Fiona Bruce MP, who proposed the explicit prohibition of sex selection abortion, and other right-wing forces use the feminist language of choice and sex discrimination, in effect to subvert the feminist goals of freedom and autonomy. To make matters worse, at the same time, dubious statistical evidence in support of the criminalization of sex selection abortion was produced by right-wing organizations such as the anti-immigration think tank Migration Watch. They too were using sex selection abortion to justify their extreme immigration policies. And whilst both forces on the right had different rationales, they came together in an alliance that spelt profound dangers, not just for Asian women, but for all women. So as you can see, it was a tricky minefield to tread. As Black and minority feminists, we could not afford to make alliances with those that appropriated the language of feminism to achieve their long-term goal of unraveling the feminist struggle for reproductive rights or the struggle for migrant justice. This is why I strongly believe that as feminists, we must create our own autonomous movements to understand how experiences of choice and coercion on issues to do with reproduction play out differently amongst different groups of women, both locally and internationally. And to find ways of knitting these experiences together within a wider framework of democratic rights and in solidarity with each other. We must be amongst the first to defend not only women's rights, but also democratic rights, because they go hand in hand. As democracy expands, so do women's rights and vice versa. This is why some of us, as Black feminists, remain located in left spaces, problematic as they are, and why aligning ourselves with the right is a no-go area. I think no one understands that better at the moment than the Iranian women.
Yes, so Catherine Acosta, and I was heavily involved in WDI USA when it was originally starting to form. And I'm a retired sociologist and an amateur filmmaker. So what we're going to do here is show a clip from a short I made, a video short, that gives an overview of the Council for National Policy and some of its member organizations that some of our feminists have been working with or collaborating with in some way in recent years. So the Council for National Policy, if you never heard of it, was formed by Republican operatives around 1980 in the wake of all those social movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the civil rights and the anti-war and all that. And so they formed the Council for National Policy to push back on all that, and they started creating these organizations. So what we're going to see here is starting up with Heritage Foundation, which is one of their foundational organizations.
Heritage Foundation, funded by corporate interests and co-founded by Paul Weyrich, is a key organization in the CNP network. Their first mandate for leadership in 1981 offered 2,000 specific ideas for reducing the federal government, increasing military spending, and ending affirmative action programs for women and other minorities. The Reagan administration adopted 60% of them. By the 1980s, the women's movement had become the most dynamic force for social change in the country. So Heritage's first mandate for leadership warned of the increasing political leverage of feminist interests and the infiltration of a feminist network into government agencies. Heritage describes critical race theory as dangerous, subversive, and sinister. and identified banning it as one of their top 2 issues in 2021. Their other top issue in 2021 was tightening voter laws. Co-founder Paul Weyrich famously said in 1980 that he didn't want everyone to vote. Another early and key institution in the CNP network is Concerned Women for America, founded specifically to oppose the women's movement. The stated mission of CWA is to protect and promote biblical values and to impact the culture for Christ. Like Heritage, CWA opposes critical race theory, homosexuality, and abortion rights. CWA has consistently opposed the 1979 UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and continues to meet regularly with Senate staffers to lobby against it. CWA also regularly lobbies against reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and did so even before gender identity language was inserted into the act. In a 2012 article, Janice Shaw Krause, a senior fellow at CWA's research arm, called VAWA a boondoggle for feminists and an attack on men. In 1994, at the UN World Conference on Women, Krause gave a talk on feminism and how it's been an unmitigated disaster for women. Abortion rights, she said, is not about the pursuit of hedonist pleasure. Radical feminists accurately see abortion as the ultimate weapon to escape the control of men. Abortion gives a woman the power to escape giving birth to a child that would connect her to the father for the child's whole life. Alliance Defending Freedom is a key Council for National Policy organization. ADF seeks to dismantle the separation of church and state and has successfully litigated a number of Supreme Court cases toward that goal. In Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, ADF successfully argued that Affordable Care Act mandates requiring businesses to cover birth control in health insurance plans for their employees violated the religious freedom of the owners of the craft store chain. ADF successfully argued that disallowing the Good News Bible clubs in after-school programs in public schools violated the free speech of the organization sponsoring the clubs. Catherine Stewart, who has studied Christian nationalism for more than a decade, says that it should be understood as primarily a political movement. Their interpretation of Christianity provides the ideological framework for an authoritarian, patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist regime. In aid of corporate interests, ADF successfully litigated one of the most devastating Supreme Court cases for American democracy, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. The court ruled that limiting corporate spending on elections violates the free speech of corporations. ADF has expanded beyond the United States, with offices in Geneva, Mexico City, Vienna, Brussels, London, and many other cities around the world. ADF UK is already working to oppose protest buffer zones around abortion clinics in the name of free speech. Independent Women's Forum grew out of the group Women for Judge Thomas, organized by Rosalie Ricky Silberman. Her aim was to support Thomas when law professor Anita Hill accused him of sexual harassment during his Supreme Court nomination hearing. Although Independent Women's Forum is a secular organization, it is another Council for National Policy network group and frequently works with Christian nationalist groups in the CNP network. IWF promotes traditional family values, and their sister organization, Independent Women's Voice, has funded anti-abortion candidates for political office. The organization positions itself as nonpartisan, but Heather Higgins, president of Independent Women's Voice, board chair of Independent Women's Forum, and Gold Circle member of the Council for National Policy, tells potential donors that this pretense is advantageous for drawing women into the conservative orbit. Being branded as neutral, she says, but actually conservative, puts us in a unique position. Our value is that we can take a conservative message and package it in a way that will be acceptable to women who would otherwise not listen to a right-wing organization. IWF specializes in using feminist arguments to advocate right-wing positions. For example, IWF has argued that gun control is sexist, that paid family leave harms women, and that regulating e-cigarettes would discriminate against women. Independent Women's Forum has regularly defended men's rights. They have opposed the Violence Against Women Act, in part because it perpetuates the idea that society is hostile to women. Historically, IWF has opposed Title IX, arguing that it forces schools to artificially manufacture interest in sport among women and harms men by taking resources for sport away from them. Now that the issue of trans-identified males in women's sport has emerged, IWF has joined with other Council for National Policy organizations and with Save Women's Sport, Wolf, and WDI USA in a Title IX coalition to oppose this development. These are just 4 of the many organizations networked with the Council for National Policy, but they are the key groups with whom some U.S. radical feminists have partnered and coordinated. Their principal arguments for working with anti-feminist, Christian nationalist organizations is that the gender identity issue constitutes an emergency, and that we can set aside issues with which we disagree and focus on this single issue. But do we agree on the gender identity issue? What feminists mean by gender is a set of sex role stereotypes, norms, characteristics, expected behaviors, assigned on the basis of sex, and that reinforce male supremacy. For Christian nationalists, these sex role stereotypes are innate. To defy them is unnatural. Many of them blame feminists for creating the gender identity problem through feminist critique of gender and refusing gender conformity. For the radical right, the term gender ideology encompasses feminism, lesbian and gay rights, and transgenderism, and they intend to roll back the gains of all 3. The difference between feminist and Christian nationalist views of gender affects outcomes of jointly produced law and policy. Consider the Women's Bill of Rights, authored by Women's Liberation Front and Women's Independent Voice, introduced in Congress last May. The bill affirms that in federal law, the terms woman, girl, and mother refer to human females. Unlike the Equal Rights Amendment, it's not written to affirm women's equal standing with men in the Constitution. It merely affirms biological difference. And rather than raising the standard of judicial scrutiny for sex-based discrimination to the same level as for race-based and religious-based discrimination, the Women's Bill of Rights specifically calls for the lower standard, intermediate scrutiny, to be applied. So while the bill, if enacted, would ensure sex-segregated locker rooms in sport, it offers little protection from sex-based discrimination. The bill's far-right sponsors speak of protecting women and their unique role in reproduction, recalling past justifications for discrimination against women. The bill reflects primarily the interests of the more powerful anti-feminist organization with whom Wolf has partnered.
Our next speaker, I have 2 more speakers for you. Our next speaker is Philippa Harvey. Philippa is a primary teacher, trade union activist and socialist. She's been active in the labour movement for more than 30 years, including as an executive committee member of the National Union of Teachers and the National Education Union. And she has served on the TUC General Council. She's been chair of the TUC Women's Committee and is a past president of the NUT, now the NEU. She has a long history of challenging sexism and sexual harassment in schools, in her own union and in the wider trade union movement through the creation of resources, schemes of work, training materials, policies, the organising of conferences and events and political organising. She is a founding member of Women's Place UK.
Thank you very much. This morning, as we discuss women's autonomy in the labour movement, I want to begin by saying, 1, it has to be built on the premise of equality. That means confronting racism head-on and ensuring that women's rights are at the centre of everything that we do. 2, that we are clearly in a fight to be had. There is a fight to be had in the left movement, just as there is everywhere. But walking away is not an option. Look at what Labour Women's Declaration are doing in the Labour Party and the work that they are doing there. And 3, we have to be at the centre of these movements, because if we're not there, they are not going to be working for us, but against us. So, I'm going to share with you some examples of what women have done to shape the movement so far and the potential for us to continue to shape it so that it reflects our needs in the workplace and beyond, influencing wider society. Remember, women have been at the very heart of this the trade union movement from the outset. The match workers, the chain makers, Dagenham women. Women win when women organise. So we've learnt from these women, learnt from their successes, their willingness to stand up and their courage in that. If the systems and the mechanisms are not working for you, you have to get in there and expose them and change them. To do this, you have to know how they are currently working, or maybe I should say more accurately, how they are not working well enough for you, for women yet. You have to understand the barriers to women being involved, to being able to share, develop and implement their ideas. These barriers have to be challenged and removed by exposing the inequality that lies behind them. So, understand the structures and the rules and change them based on data, facts, law, and rational argument. I want to give you some examples of what this can look like. First, you have to get women talking and realising that their union, this movement, is relevant and can work for them. So, in the NEU, we set up women's networks. Women created these networks for ourselves and for other women. They were informal. They were not policy making. They did not fall within the formal structures of the union. But therefore, these women developed the format, the mechanisms, the structures under which they would operate. Union staff were invited to support their work, and as the activities and their impact began to grow, they began to report to regional councils, and then regional councils began to support the networks. We organised events to explore the history of suffragettes, the match workers, abortion rights, women's roles in international solidarity and stereotyping. Emboldened and supported by other women in the union, we went back to the formal union structures and started to organise for change. Women had organised and won space, put women's issues onto the agenda successfully, but they had also brought more women into activity, into union activity. Women were asked to speak about organising, and this model of building activism was replicated in other areas of the union. Now it was time to tackle the policy-making bodies of the union. This meant challenging and changing rules. We couldn't rely on the goodwill of the movement to recognise that it should be representative of its membership. We would have to ensure that it was. Rule changes had to be brought in. We needed to hear from women, and this meant hearing from women speak at conference in debate. So our first modest demand was that at least half the speakers in a union that is 75% of women needed to be women. I know, you'd think, wouldn't you? We proposed a system to ensure that happened, despite the arguments that women might not want to speak. Again, you'd think. Now, once a motion is in debate, the speakers are ordered. This is what happens now. Female, not female. And the percentage of women speaking at our conference is now around 60%. This means we are also increasing the number of new and young speakers, as well as speakers from minoritised groups. We are getting there. We were prepared. We had the data that showed that the unions were not representing our membership. We stood firm. We organised. We campaigned. We also had the technology, and we won. And the union is better for it. Next, we needed to look at the leadership, the executive. Again, it had to represent the membership. So it needed to be at least 50% women. We put a motion to have a working party where we developed the rationale and the logistics on that working party. We had the data, the facts, and the wherewithal to do it. At conference, we had a strong case for rule changes. And again, despite the arguments that women might not want to come forward, we won. And lo and behold, we now have an executive that has more than 50% women. This has now also had the impact that there is an expectation that the national union delegations, committees, etc. are 50% women. This is not a written rule, but it is an expectation. And the NEU has just agreed to improve this further by ensuring that at the next executive election, 2/3 of those elected will be women. There is still work to do, but we do not have illusions. We need to increase the representation of women delegates at conference. This is where our policy is decided. This is where voting is carried out. We know women are underrepresented. If there's a rule that says a delegation must be 50% women, branches have to work harder to find the women who are active locally. They are there. We know this because we know that women are well represented at rep level. We also know it because in some branches they've been monitoring their delegations for a number of years to ensure they represent their membership. And these branches do send more women to represent their members. This work has taken time, but we have won. And and now we have ingrained women into the movement. This is why we should continue, because it's our movement. And if we walk away, we concede. And those victories that the match workers, the chain makers, the Dagenham women, and each group of women in their own unions who've made that space in the union say we were only ever visitors, and we most certainly were not. This movement is not perfect. It is also not entirely lost or won. It is down to us as women activists within this movement to follow in the footsteps of the women of the past and make it work for women now. We must maintain the space that women in the movement have won and set the agenda to win more, whether that means working within or outside the existing structures. Then the movement must be made to work for the women here and outside in society. Thank you very much.
So our final speaker is Ali Cisse. Ali is a feminist activist and community organiser. She's taken part in solidarity actions with migrants in northern France and on the UK border, helped to organise the Brighton Rise Up campaign, and is currently a member of the Women's Place UK events team and a core member of Brighton Women's Liberation Collective, which organises a monthly women-only discussion group called Sister Salon.
So where am I coming from on everything that we've seen and heard today? I'm a campaigner, an activist, and I'm on the left. I'm not an academic. I'm a single mum. I'm a survivor, like so many of us with ongoing abuse. I juggle paid work with the unpaid work of motherhood, and like so many, every part of my life is made smaller and more difficult under the diminishing welfare state that is characteristic of right-wing Tory governments. It's my belief that for women's lives to improve, we require a government or a state that will address and alleviate the inequalities that women face because of our sex. We need a functioning welfare state, a government that doesn't leave women behind by pushing us into poverty, doesn't strip our services, supports us if we are mothers instead of punishing us, and of course gives us safe abortion free at the point of need. So when I say that I'm on the left, when I say I am left-wing, this is what I mean. And when we talk about why left matters and why right matters, that's what I mean. So that's to start with for this. As everyone has explained so beautifully so far, we find ourselves in a tricky spot. The institutionalised left betrays us, and the right sends us quite literally to the food bank. So what do? What is the feminist response? Well, we do what women have done for hundreds of years. We take it into our own hands. We think about the changes that we want, and we organise, we collectivise, and we strategise, and we get to work. And importantly, we organise in a way that leaves no woman left behind. In 2015, in my local press, I read about a young Eritrean woman. She was heavily pregnant and travelling with her 4-year-old daughter alone. They'd travelled literally across mountains, across deserts, and across seas. And here they were, sleeping with no cover, no food, and no protection in a graveyard in Calais. Their shelter was quite literally a bush. The little support there was completely inaccessible to her, and she was not alone. She was not an anomaly, but one of thousands of displaced people living in squalor in tented communities along the UK borders. Being a Brighton woman, that's 30 miles from my front doorstep, so very close. As the situation worsened and stories hit the press, the preceding response by the British people was phenomenal. It was collectivised, and what isn't reported is it was largely women-led. Faced with the reality of government and NGO inaction, women acted. And what did they achieve? Well, there was, of course, basic delivery of donated tents, clothes, food. The system was far from perfect, but those without basic provisions now had them. But from this extraordinary, things grew. We recruited doctors, dentists, sexual health nurses. Donated caravans became clinics with on-call rotas and hubs of information. Weekly dental clinics addressed painful abscesses, and in fact became a running joke that UK volunteers in Calais could get better dental care there in the camp than they could back in the UK. This was true. We made noise, we raised funds, we facilitated visits by MPs and artists. British women funded and established a women's centre, a temporary building fundraised by women and designed by a female architect. But many women in the camps were hard to reach, frightened to move freely or under the control of traffickers. To reach them, we had to be creative. so we made up manicure parcels. Donated, of course, from local businesses, again, mostly women. The kits were welcomed with open arms and self-distributed, freely passed from woman to woman, practically invisible to the eyes of controlling men. Harmless women's stuff given by well-meaning volunteers. And tucked away in those kits, we packed condoms, we packed Canesten cream, we packed hemorrhoid cream, cold sore cream, moisturisers for skin cracking from the cold. We packed information and we packed UK contact numbers. We built an autonomous active movement that in tricky situations had to be creative, that got on with the job at hand, that knew when to be covert and when to be noisy as hell. It took women's basic needs as a starting point and enabled them to live slightly improved lives. But when the institutionalised left failed to address the proliferation of these camps at our border, the far right began to circle. The people there, both men and women, were vulnerable not only to the racist thugs, notorious for their attacks on refugees in northern France, but the unmitigated racism of the Calais police too. Racism flamed too often by rhetoric peddled by those in nice suits on slick social media channels. Rhetoric from UK figureheads, from people like Tommy Robinson, Sophie Corcoran, designed to build a moral panic around the arrival of refugees, played a significant role in breathing life into racism that is so antithetical to the needs of women. It is this rhetoric that led to a battery of a British woman, you probably will remember her, Sam Sun, on UK streets. She was pregnant, she was pushed to the ground and kicked. A brutal and sustained attack as David Gallagher kicked and kicked and kicked her until she miscarried her twins. Her crime was for wearing hijab. So it is unforgivable to minimise or hand-wave away the danger posed to women and girls by extreme right-wing groups, because a truly feminist response leaves no women behind. Back on the English coast, women in my own home city of Brighton are also having a terrible time. Our council, in their wisdom, have allowed our services to be asset stripped. A Tory procurement process based on value for money, not feminist values, has been used to defund our specialist single-sex domestic violence refuge. Meanwhile, our rape crisis centre has been so captured by identity politics that it refuses to offer any single-sex services at all. So women did what we had to do. And what women have always done, we collectivised. A hostile environment, we organised in private. It gave us security to highlight the needs and discuss strategy, and it was a good start. But a hushed feminist response behind closed doors can only go so far. We need to do more than that. Those of us that can need to speak loudly, speak without shame, take up space, and state over and over and over again the needs of women and girls. And we need to do it face to face like we are today and building bonds. And from that came the birth of Brighton Women's Liberation Collective, of which Danny is also a part. A publicly advertised monthly women-only drop-in session, self-funded with a free creche, because we don't want to leave any women behind. We take up space. We work together to set priorities, and we work together to produce strategies. And as fractures present themselves in our online feminist community, as they are doing, we hope to be some form of antidote. Real-life conversations, working out our priorities and principles together. And the outcome has been refreshingly radical. So where has this got us in Brighton? Well, a considerable distance. The Chance Toolkit, although far from perfect, is now not recognisable from its original versions. The council, unable to ignore our Rise Up campaign, now has a domestic abuse strategy pledging single-sex refuge spaces, and where women had fallen to the bottom of the equality pile, we're putting ourselves back on the agenda. Hundreds of local women have signed our open letter backing the wonderful Sarah Surviving, who has been here but left yesterday. You can find her on Twitter. And now Brighton women have explicitly single-sex monthly drop-ins, something unthinkable only a few years ago. And with every meeting, more women join. And with so many problems in Brighton still to solve, it fills me with excitement to think what can happen next. We cannot wait for others to give us permission to solve the problems that are facing us. And we cannot enter into women's rights with a consumer mentality, waiting for perfect organisations, perfect political parties, policies, or perfect charities. And neither do we want or need shelter from the extreme right, and nor do we lend them our work for their political gain. So be active now, be loud now, because we are living now and we need things to be better for us now. Thank you.
So it's now 11 o'clock, which is the time we should have finished the session. I'm going to give the speakers 3 minutes each to respond to the points that have been raised on the floor, and then we're going to finish the discussion. But I would like to thank everybody for a really constructive conversation and to take on board the things that everybody has been saying about how important it is to have these discussions face to face. So please continue to talk to each other. So I'm going to go in reverse order from how they spoke before. So Ali, to start.
Okay. Firstly, to Claire, I can't see you now. I think you're sitting down. So much love to you from everybody at Women's Place UK. You've been fantastic in supporting our work, and most of us did see a lot of the abuse and harassment that you got. And I want to be explicitly clear, as a white woman, that it is not good enough just to be anti-racist. We talk about using our voices, so we use our voices to say things, and we need to be explicitly anti-racist. So when issues come up, and they always will, right? There will always be issues in every movement, whether it's misogyny, homophobia, or racism, that we keep our own house clean, and that white women explicitly say it time and time again, that we will do the work that is required to do that, so you don't have to. And just to refer to what a sister in the Green Party said back there, completely, we must make space for women to discuss things, to change their minds. But we are a political movement, and political movements don't work unless we're explicitly clear about our values and what we want, right? That's what's different. So it's not too much to ask people to be explicitly clear about their lines, their boundaries, and what they want, because then we know how to collectivise and how to work together. So it is important to say those things. And then I wanted just to go back to Jenny about Sister Salon. You can find us online. It's a very simple format. We hire a room monthly. We put it on Eventbrite. We have a free creche. We're funded entirely by donations of women that attend. We are in the process of trying to get grants. Brighton Council has kept us waiting for about 6 months now, because we're obviously using single-sex exceptions, and they're asking us bizarre questions. We were very, very lucky to get a really generous donation by a woman that was here yesterday who donated us £500, because the first 7 months has been difficult with a surplus of about 20 quid in the bank. But we do consciousness raising, but the women there set the tone of what they want to speak about and what actions they want to do.
I suppose I just talk a little bit more about why we absolutely must stay in the movement. Women are make up at least half the trade union movement, at least that. And in some unions, we make up a huge majority, certainly in the union that I'm in. And we've achieved so much for women in the trade union movement. Just a couple of examples, like in the Republic of Ireland, for example, if you look at the work they've done around abortion rights in the Republic of Ireland, the instrumental work they did around Repeal the 8th, the trade union movement was so important in that. And since then, they've done work on how abortion is a workplace issue, and the guidance that they've produced around that is just groundbreaking. We can't walk away from that type of influence. And the work in my own union on sexual harassment and sexism in schools is absolutely vital to making schools better places for the young people that we work with. we can't walk away from that type of influence. So it's really important that we stay in our trade unions and do that type of work to make just make society a better place. And it's women who are driving that work. And so it's really important that we do that. I wanted to pick up the fact that someone talked about how we fought racism, we fought sexism, and we understood that, and it was easy to do that. There were people who didn't agree with that. We had to have that fight in the trade union movement, and we had to move people on the anti-racism work and the anti-sexism work. And to be fair, we still are moving people on those issues within those areas of equality work that we're doing in our unions. So we keep moving people all the time, and we stay there to have those campaigns and those fights. And that's exactly what we are doing in my union. We're doing it in the trade union movement as a whole. And sometimes we'll have setbacks, and sometimes we then regroup and we think about how we do that. And that's, I think that's why you stay where you are. Sometimes it's not you that stays there, but you leave a succession behind you so that there are more people coming up behind you to do that work. Certainly social media is playing a part, but you bring women together, you create those networks. In real life is clearly more important, but that's what the trade union movement is based on. It's based on debate. It started on having people in large groups having debates, or in small groups having debates, and then they organise, and then they strategise, and then they build campaigns. That is the trade union movement. They're there to agitate and to change things, and that's what we will continue to do. There was an attack on FiLiA in my own union earlier on this year, and we did not let that attack go unchallenged in the NEU, and we opened people's eyes to a lot of the nonsense that was talked about FiLiA. And that's because there were so many people in our union who knew that it was a nonsense. And it's enabled us to put our position to even more people now in our union. And many more now see the attack for what it was, an outrageous assault on what is a fantastic organisation. And so I'm very proud to be here speaking today. I'm here in a personal capacity, but I know now that in the NEU there are loads more people who know what a fantastic organisation this is, and that's down to the fact that there are many people in the NEU who now know what FiLiA is and the work that it does.
Okay, so first on intermediate scrutiny, I don't want to bore our UK sisters with this constitutional thing, but I will say that I have a longer article on my Substack, catherinemacosta.substack.com, that goes into it and that cites legal journal articles on the limitations of intermediate scrutiny for women's rights. But you can read more about it there. Also, the article was written in consultation with some very good lawyers, including a Harvard-trained lawyer. So you can read the article if you want to know more about it. It was very lightly touched on in here. What I really wanted to say, though, is the one thing that I hope that we can go away with is to understand how sneaky the radical right is today. I hope that's what you can take from the video and when we show the longer one. How sneaky they are today. When you look at something like Independent Women's Forum and they are saying, oh, we can position ourselves as nonpartisan. You know, in the past we could point to, oh, look, that's a Christian right organization and we know patriarchal religion is bad for women. We know this is bad. But then you have Independent Women's Forum that wants to repackage it and use the language of feminism in order to push a right-wing message. So we have to be a lot smarter, a lot savvier in how we analyze these things, and especially with free speech, because Alliance Defending Freedom is now using, instead of litigating on the basis of religious freedom, they're litigating on the basis of free speech. So they try to impose their theocratic agenda, like Bible study classes in public schools, on the basis that not allowing it, not that it's a violation of their religious freedom, but a violation of free speech. And we can easily be tempted into this. It's hard because our free speech has been attacked by the trans rights movement. I mean, I don't have to tell anybody in this room about that. How many people's free speech has been suppressed by that? But at the same time, we have to understand how the religious right is going to capitalize on that now and go for the free speech angle. So we got to be really smart in our strategies and our analysis about going forward?
I kind of don't know what to think. I'm kind of bewildered because I feel like I've been in a coma and just woken up to us discussing, let's develop a feminist movement. It feels bizarre. What's bizarre, what's even more bizarre, is the idea that we're even sitting here discussing a feminism that has any links with the right. To me, it's a no-brainer. If there is any alliance with the right, then we're not feminists. We cannot be. If we are feminists, then we do what Ali was saying, which is we leave no one behind. If there are feminists who are working with the right, I am left behind. Black women are left behind. I think one of the things that we would all do well, including myself, is remind myself of the feminist history that's gone on before us. Because people have fought and given their lives for us to be where we are. And we should at least do the courtesy of remembering that history, remembering not just the history of women who fought at Dagenham factory, but Jaya Ben Desai, who also broke barriers within the trade union movement when she challenged the trade union movement as well as her bosses, right? And in the process also said something about anti-racism. You know, the imperial typewriter strikers, who are all Asian women who broke barriers, and there are so many others, and those are the women whose legacy I have inherited. And it seems to me that they didn't fight for us to go wandering off to the right, you know. And so I think that doesn't mean also that the left is in a good place. Sometimes the left behaves so much like the right that I wonder why we call them the left. But what I think that means for us as feminists is we have to be the custodians of left politics. And being custodians of the left politics means, of course, we make mistakes. Of course, we try and navigate this really difficult space that we're in. But I think at the moment, for me, the biggest thing that I have to do, I wake up every day and I say to myself, never stop being a Democrat. And if you are a Democrat, then you cannot be with the right. Since when did feminism stop being democratic? And I think that is the challenge for us. Well, I think that we ought not to be thinking, even contemplating anything to do with the right. We have to move forward a democratic, universalist politics that ensures that at the heart of our agenda is, of course, equality and progressive social justice for everyone. This is a tricky, tricky task. We will lose a lot, and what frightens me is how quickly gains that have been fought for over a century are lost overnight. And we are seeing this around the world. So I think we just have to, redouble our efforts, be vigilant, be constantly fighting, and being brave and shedding our fearlessness. If the women in Iran can do it under the most difficult circumstances, why can't we? Why can't we? So let's stop talking about anything to do with the right. Let's talk about what does being a feminist mean, and how do we bridge the gap between anti-racism, anti-fundamentalism, feminism, and progressive social justice.
Thank you to all our wonderful speakers. Thank you to all of you for coming, and let's carry on talking to each other.